Good evening. I go by the quotes of David Nicolay. But the thing about literature is, well, basically it encapsulates all the disciplines. It's history, philosophy, politics, sociology, psychology, linguistics, and science. Literature is mankind's organized response to the world around him or her. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the PG and Research Department of English, Bishop Heber College, I wholeheartedly welcome all for the Faculty Development Program. I welcome the faculty friends, research scholars, and students for the third day of the FDP on science fiction. Department of English always paves its own style in organizing lectures on various topics, sharing knowledge from the expertise in and around the region. On the first day, Professor of English Dr. Arun Lal from Government College, Mokari, Kozhikode, Kerala, shared his views on the title Science Fiction and the Poetics of the Post-Human. On the second day, we had Dr. Lakshmi R. Nayak, Professor of English, Government College, Kottayam, Kerala, who shared her views on the title Reality Ahead of Schedule, Tools of Scholarship. And today, we are connected to listen to the lecture of Dr. Abdul Ali Jinnah, Professor of English, Jamal Mohammed College, Trichy, Tamil Nadu, on the title From Kaijus to Chekhov's X and Everything Else in Between, Understanding the Tropes of Contemporary Science Fiction. Before we step inside the next segment, a very brief introduction on the resource person. Dr. Abdul Ali Jinnah, an associate professor of Jamal Mohammed College, is an illustrious alumnus of Pondicherry Central University and a gold medalist of the class of 1998. He acts as guest professor at universities in Indonesia, including the state universities of Semarang. He has delivered special lectures in more than 100 national and international conferences in different parts of India and in countries like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Malaysia, Bhutan, Philippines, Nepal, and Indonesia. Dr. Jinnah has 22 years of teaching and 14 years of research experience. He is a member of the Gothic Association of New Zealand and Australia and a reviewer for Common Ground Research Network, University of Elena's Research Park. He is a creative writer and has published flash fiction and horror narratives, which are the best sellers in Amazon. He also offers creative writing courses and is an academic consultant on writing Gothic fiction program in the University of Surakarta, Central Java. His inclination in research is towards pop culture, direct narratives, and post-human discourses. He is also an expert in literary theory and in digital humanities. Sir, we are very eager to listen to your lecture, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We feel really honored, privileged, and proud to have you having connected for this FDP program, sir. Your resume runs for pages. I have shortlisted it, and it's a very brief. I express myself if I've left out anything which has to be included. The session is all yours, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Just one thing you left out is that I might have delivered like 100 lectures in so many different institutions, but my best lectures have always been in Bishop Heber College. And evidence, of course, is over there. My good friends, Dr. Suresh and Dr. Melvin. I don't know, it is something about your institution, be it offline or online. There's something about your institution that motivates me to do really well. And always, you have some kind of a limitation. I always try to outreach that whenever it is about Bishop Heber College. So that was one thing which we left out, obviously not deliberately, but this is something I really had to point out. So based on that, we're going to have a very small discussion on science fiction. It's a genre that has always been my favorite right from childhood, because I have grown up reading the texts of the golden age of science fiction. And when I was a student in Pondicherry Central University, one of my teachers, Dr. Kalpana, she introduced a course for us that was science fiction. So in that course, she actually made us write also. So it was not just, the analysis of science fiction. It was also about the writing of science fiction. So I'm not a great storyteller, or I'm not a great writer, but my first narrative experience was writing a story of science fiction, which had to do with black holes. So that kind of got me hooked. And I think it's been a long journey from there to here, roughly around 30 odd years. So from that class of 96 to this session, which we're having in 2022, so many things have changed. The entire oeuvre of the writers has changed. The genre has undergone such a great, amazing transformation. There was a time when it was on the fringes of literature. There were not many people who were ready to write, what we call the so-called literary writers. They're not ready to write, dabble in this particular genre. And there were not many takers in the reading public also. So it was considered to be more of a potboiler, or something that was a bestseller. But I think things have changed now. So that change is something that I would like to focus on today, and maybe just give you. I'm sure that the students of today are so much into science fiction; they know better. But I would just like to give you my experiences of science fiction as a reader, and maybe as a teacher here and there. So that is what led me to this title also, because I watch a lot of science fiction movies. And then, of course, I read a lot. So from Kaiju, which is basically Japanese horror / monster movies, to Chekhov's egg, which was first used in the 1979 Ridley Scott movie, Alien. We'll come to that in the future slides. So taking two different broad ends of the spectrum, I just thought that why not move from this end to the other and stop somewhere in between at important signposts, and maybe from there, we develop a kind of an understanding of what science fiction actually entails. The very name is paradoxical, right? I mean, science and fiction, they're supposed to be sort of never, the twain shall never meet. That kind of two different systems of thought. But then some bright person thought that why not just bring these two together and talk about an notion that is called science fiction. So I love the paradox that is there in the naming. And that obviously leads us to a very new historicist question, something that Montrose was asked and was able to answer very convincingly. Is there a textuality of history, and is there a historicity of text? There's something which is common notion today. Everyone knows this. So I'm just borrowing from that notion and trying to ask you this. Can science be fictionalized? Or fiction, can it ever become scientific? Because as I said, these are two different systems of thought. One is supposedly logical, rational, and the other is supposedly illogical and absolutely absurd and irrational. But they have kind of violently yoked these things together, and we have this very powerful medium of expression, this genre today, which gives us a very convincing answer that yes, science can be fictionalized. And yes, fiction can also become scientific, because if fiction deals with the realms of the human imagination, then come on, so does science. Science starts with a hypothesis. It moves on to an experimentation. It moves on to archetypes and prototypes and what not, to alpha versions and beta versions and what not. And then you have the object or the system or the scientific rule or the tradition in front of you. That's how it starts. But remember, it starts in the mind. So when you consider that, just hark back to a seminal science fiction novel like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, written by, I would call him a futurologist. I would not just call him a, a narrator, a storyteller. He's a futurologist because he predicted a kind of a future. It's a very exciting ride. It entails a vision of the underwater, of the deep seas, which even today, you know that, right? Even today has not been completely conquered. But you have Captain Nemo, who takes us on this scintillating journey in his submarine called the Nautilus, and he showcases all the wonders of the deep seas. You have giant squids, you have octopuses, you have sharks, you have, you know, hidden wealth, and you have shipwrecks. And in all that, you have the basis for a very important scientific invention that is yet to come, and that is the submarine, a ship that can move underwater. Now, of course, I think throughout the chronicles of history, a lot of storytellers have regaled us with all these fantastic ideas of ships that can, let's say, fly, ships that can disappear, ships that can go underwater. I'm basically sticking only with that archetype of the ship because that's the point that I'm trying to make. But yes, that was fantasy. But this is science fiction because Jules Verne was able to give us the scientific basis for these kind of devices, the scientific basis for these kind of ships, of these kind of vehicles. And it's as if, you know, that's why I call him a futurologist. It's as if you predicted that in a future age, the submarines would actually carry people. It happened. Science made it possible. And remember, to commemorate that this idea came from a genius of storytelling, the first submarine was named the Nautilus. So I think that is the greatness of this novel, or rather, I would put my foot in the mouth and give you this. That is the greatness of science fiction also, because it kind of envisages that this, okay, right now it's not a possibility, but this will eventually become not just possible, but right there in front of our eyes, right in our hands. So that is where the confluence of these two paradoxes, of these two completely different streams of thought, they kind of come together and they become the larger version of themselves. From science to fiction, and from fiction to science, they get together and form this seamless, I should say, transition from one to the other. So I hope I have kind of proved my point. Let's move on with some other examples. I just mentioned that Jules Verne can be considered as one of the forerunners of the scientific narratives or the science fiction narratives in the West. But even before him, we did have this dashing real life hero, an adventurer, that was Cyrano de Bergerac, who wrote, which is arguably one of the first examples of science fiction in France, in French literature, which is called The Voyage to the Moon. Of course, it had its sister also. It's actually two novels in one. One is Voyage to the Moon and the other is Voyage to the Sun. So you basically had, you know, Cyrano de Bergerac, who shoots himself in a rocket, a kind of a rocket, propels himself into the moon and then propels himself into the sun. And there he finds natives, you know, lunar natives and solar natives. And he kind of interacts with them and becomes chummy with them, and then he comes back. He makes the return journey, and on the return journey, he actually sees to it that, some of those natives, they sort of accompany him. And once they come here, he makes them as circus exhibits, and they're literally like freaks, so, and people throng to his, what do we say, the exhibitions, and they literally pay him a lot of money. So the alien, lunar and the solar alien, they are brought back to Earth, and they become sort of curious exhibits. Now, I'm not going into the political agenda of this as of now. Let's save it for a future slide. From there, I come to, again, a very interesting novel like The Day of the Triffids, written by John Wyndham, which was basically a look at how plants not just become sentients, but plants also become masters of the world. So it's basically a kind of, plants taking revenge on us. So what happens if there are killer plants, and these killer plants sort of take over humanity? I think that is one of the major fear factors that we have, that one day humanity might be annihilated and a different system or a different species possibly might overtake us. So scientific history has always told us that this is something that is eventually going to happen. So, there would be a mass extinction, and the mass extinction would be followed by another species taking over the planet. That's how we took over the planet. Yeah, that's how we became the masters of this planet. So that was the scare which Wyndham's Day of the Triffids kind of evoked in the audience. And then on the other end, you have a novel like The Left Hand of Darkness, where, Ursula K. Le Guin establishes herself as the master of the genre. But no, I should not be using that word master, right? As the mistress of the genre. And she tells us that, look, women's writing in this particular explorative genre is definitely going to be far, far better than what you guys, you males, can actually give us. So the language, the setting, the characterization, everything became very, very filled with femdoms. I think this is the place where the very term femdom actually gains official currency. So the world of women, not as in, an exclusive world, which sort of, is away from, let's say, the pause of human male society. It's more of a broad-based universe where women are seen as the centralized, foregrounded individuals, and men are seen more as, the margins. That was something fascinating. It comes at the height of the radical feminist movement, and Le Guin is able to kind of appropriate the genre of science fiction, which is supposedly very manly, kind of stud, into something, that's why I use that term, appropriation, something into something that is very feminine. And, suddenly science fiction, feminist science fiction became fashionable. It became in vogue. You had an influx of writers who dabble in that with excellent success ratios. So it's not that, science fiction does not have a say or it does not hold ground. It's always been prime property. It's always been there. But unfortunately, since we always talk about this idea of highbrow literature or the idea of creating something literary, we sort of push it to the extremes. We kind of keep it in the margins. But remember, science fiction is not about the use of literary language only. Science fiction is more subversive because within the folds of its fantasy or, let's say, vivid imagination, It's actually a sort of shake to us and show us what society really is. So that is the way I have to look at science fiction, not as a fringe, but as a sort of reality that is coached, hidden in something that is vivid imagination. But it's always been a problematic for the analysts or even the theorists of science fiction. How exactly do I put something? For example, is there something that is really called scientific fiction? Do I call it SF? Do I call it sci-fi? Or do I just use that formal terminology of science fiction? And if I do use something like science fiction, do I call it hard science fiction and soft science fiction? Do I kind of differentiate between this and the other? So is hard science fiction the order of the day? As in, hard science fiction is something that is more intellectual, it's more scientific, it's more of a look into how science fiction becomes a kind of a literary tradition, and soft science fiction is basically more about fantasy and more about the soft sciences. So for a science fiction enthusiast who dabbles in this kind of a categorization, there is a possibility that sciences like, for example, quantum mechanics or quantum physics, which is something above the understanding of an ordinary layman like me. So maybe if a story uses those elements of quantum mechanics, or as I said, those kind of physics, then it becomes hard. And if it uses something like, let's say, biology or any of those soft sciences, then it becomes a kind of a soft. That is one categorization that many people firmly believe in, but I'm not sure, because I think science fiction is basically something that tells you a good story, and it tells you a good story in a way that it kind of creates a jouissance maybe, or a kind of a comprehension in your mind. I think that's the way we have to look at literature, basically, because I know a definition of literature is going to be very difficult, but if, let's say, per se, we have to give a definition of literature as literary students, you and I, we probably would talk about, the universality of, the stories, or how it transcends age and space and time and everything. And it gives us an understanding of human life. Come on, so does science fiction. Science fiction also gives us an understanding of human life. So when I use the term science fiction, I have to necessarily kind of differentiate it from fantasy, because fantasy is something that is only in the imagination. The mind can create anything. But when I kind of categorize it as science fiction, what is happening is it moves from the realms of fantasy, it moves into the realms of science. So there are certain rules, formulae, traditions, scientific laws that are there in nature, and these narratives, they kind of use that. So it's a kind of a scientific look at the unbridled imagination of human society, something like that. But then again comes a question, what exactly does take a primary or the primal in science fiction? For example, is it the plot? Or is it the character? Or is it the setting? Or is it the science? For example, if you take up something like the Star Wars movies, what makes it science fiction is a very interesting question, because I think it sort of stands at the cross currents of fantasy and science fiction. It comes out in the 1970s, when many of our tech developments had not yet reached complete fruition. Obviously, it never will, but it was able to use some of the imaginary aspects of, say, technology within the structure of the story. And if you and I let's say from the other generation, let's say you millennials, when you look at it, you might find the story a bit jaded. You might find the special effects absolutely dated. But what would be fascinating is that, let's say 50 years back, there was this gentleman, George Lucas, who was talking about how tech might develop, let's say in the 21st century. Of course, it's not set in the 21st century, it's set in a parallel universe. But it happens to be a social story, a social commentary. So there, we look at the story from now, from the 21st century, and we find that he had kind of, as I said, prophesied that these things might be there in society, in the world. So what gains precedence over there? I would say that as far as that story is concerned, it is the setting, because it's set in a parallel universe. It's set in a time that is so much different from ours. It's set in the galaxy. That's how the whole story starts, you know, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So it takes us back in time, and it takes us spatially also to a completely different universe. So the setting becomes the most important aspect of that story. So what happens is basically the setting becomes one of the tropes of science fiction, because whenever we talk about science fiction, one of the major tropes of science fiction is the time traveling element, or the alternate time element, or the parallel universe element. Both these things are put together along with, you know, dabblings of so many different forms of technology, of aerial warfare, of, you know, artificial planets and whatnot. I mean, it's an entire heterocosm in itself. You have to, how many movies have come by now? I believe, you know, there have been like 9 movies and so many series, web series, and, you know, OTT series, and it keeps expanding. The universe keeps expanding. And Lucasfilm, who owns that particular franchisee, have become hugely successful and hugely, you know, profitable because of, as I said, the mind of one single man who starts and then it kind of expands. I hope you are with me, because what I am trying to essentially put in a nutshell is that it's a genre that sort of is so fluid that it moves beyond the human capacity to understand and the human capacity to categorize and to sort of define. So anything can be a part of science fiction. The only thing is you need to have certain elements, certain parameters, which would take you over there. So maybe if there is someone whom you can call as the Shakespeare of science fiction, that should be H.G. Wells. He has created masterpieces. But it's not just about the creation of a science fiction heteroverse. It's also about how he shows us how exactly society is kind of disintegrating. The fear factor. Again, I'm talking about the fear factor. For obvious reasons, I have not sort of put on the slide here stories like The Invisible Man, which talks about how cruel science can be and what happens if science misfires. I'm not talking about a dystopian novel like Time Machine. That's something which is, you know that. But let's look at something like The War of the Worlds, which is a classic trope in science fiction, wherein there is an alien invasion, and what happens to humanity in case of an alien invasion. Scary, because we have a lot of people among us who are survivalists, who firmly believe that one day an alien invasion will happen. So in case an alien invasion happens, how are we going to extend the cause of humanity, of the human species? That's a question that is there on so many people's mind. You must have heard of the Doomsday Vault somewhere in the Scandinavian mountains, which sort of has, a record of every possibility that humanity has ever dabbled in and probably, will dabble in. But please try to understand that within the framework of a scientific fiction, of a science fiction, H.G. Wells is actually telling us about colonial conquest. Please understand that it is a socio-cultural document which talks about the kind of conquest which the West has been taking over to the East. So when you look at it from that perspective, what happens is the entire aura of that story changes. That is where I think a person like H.G. Wells actually sort of soars over all other writers, because he is able to give you a social phenomenon / a social condition shackled into the garb of science fiction. The Martians attacking us. If you know the ending, then you know that, it's literally the ending that rips everything away, because the Martians are ultimately defeated by human diseases. Just like the West was defeated in all its colonies by the native diseases. Look at the agenda of the novel when you take it from that perspective. I think that is what theory teaches us, right? I mean, don't look at it from a very overt kind of an understanding. Try to see the subversive elements, the agency that is always available in those stories, in those novels. So that was one. And then you had, again, a novel like Fahrenheit 451, Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which essentially for us, people like us, is very scary, doubly scary, because it talks about how a future dystopian system is going to destroy the habit of reading. Books are going to be the first casualty in a society that believes that there should be no knowledge systems of thought. So books are going to be burned. There's going to be a public burning of all books. That's exactly the title, right? Fahrenheit 451 is the degree at which paper burns. So classic take on a particular scare of, let's say, an authoritarian regime which sort of suppresses their society, their people, by giving them nothing that might lead to a kind of originality of thought or individuality of thinking. It's like, putting yourself into the hell of monotony, into the hell of complete abjection. That is where a novel like Fahrenheit 451 actually scores, because it tells us that, okay, these things are happening in, nations around you, in countries around you. Wake up. That wake up call is what Bradbury is trying to address over here. It's not necessarily that, all science fiction has to be very serious and non-humorous, has to present only the grave side of things. Sometimes the best of things are addressed in absolute humor. I'm sure you know that, postmodernists dabbled in a lot of black humor because they wanted to present this, the seriousness of life in a much more graver way. And I think laughter is the best way of presenting it that way. It kind of accentuates the trauma and the pain. If you're interested in science fiction, you absolutely have to read this particular book. I think it's a masterpiece. It's called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a masterpiece because Douglas Adams is looking at human life, let's say the absurdity of human life, via media, an absolutely farcical narrative. So you have the hero, who is the lone crusader in a system of governance, which is basically destroying everything, turning everything into the rubble, because it wants to create concrete jungles and, huge road spaces. So they say, right, for the want of a dam, sometimes rivers are destroyed, the courses are changed, and the surroundings become so parched. We have had environmentalists fighting for that. Now here you have this very meek, very small individual who's fighting for that, and the entire system is kind of crowding upon him. They're going to destroy him. But unfortunately, what happens is Earth is destroyed by an alien superpower. So from the insignificant to the significant to the significant becoming a non-significant in the order of things, in the chain of being, we find that, world which wants to destroy his house is actually destroyed by an alien. Then what happens? How does he travel? He's the only person who survives. And how does he travel all over the galaxy? That's why it's called the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The different, worlds that he travels to, discovers, and the kind of interaction which he has with them. Remember, my dear friends, what I'm trying to tell you here is that, again, hidden under the garb of black humor, Douglas Adams is actually giving us a very vitriolic social commentary. I think that is where science fiction actually scores over all other genres, because, as I said earlier, hidden in that vivid imagination, we have a real social concern that is being addressed. So when you take it up that way, we come to a kind of flux where we realize that if that be so, then is there something that is called a list of tropes? Can I put it down in a list? Because, my dear friends, if I'm trying to put it down in a list, what is happening is that I'm kind of narrowing down, bringing down the vastness of its entirety. So how do we actually look at science fiction? I would rather look at it as one of those genres of intersectionality. There's a lot of intersectional elements which you find in science fiction. For example, I think science fiction is kind of combined with any other trope. Let's say not just one, sometimes, so many different tropes are mixed together. And I would like to cite a very interesting novel that was adapted into two different movies, and both these movies, they are excellent movies, landmark. So the novel is called Who Goes There, written by a writer who probably we do not know much. That's John Campbell. I'm not even sure whether you know this particular story, Who Goes There, but I'm sure you might know the movies which it was made into. And the name of that movie is The Thing. I think it came out in the year 1991. It had, the current heartthrob, that was Kurt Russell, who was the hero of this movie. And fascinating movie, because there is an alien vehicle, UFO, which falls to Antarctica. And from that vehicle comes out a monster. It's not a monster per se, it's an alien. It's the kind of alien that is able to take the form of whatever it devours. Now that's very interesting, because we had an alien mutant in our midst in that particular story. So it falls formless, then it devours a dog, it takes over the characteristic, it becomes a dog, it becomes a mimic of that dog. Then it slowly reaches out to humanity, and it eats a man, and it takes his features. Now there are some 5 or 6 people who are there in that particular place. It's Antarctica, right? It's absolutely remote. So now these 5 people, they are caught in the uncertainty because they do not know which of them is the monster and which of them is the real human being. You understand the claustrophobic phenomenon which John Campbell creates over that? It's a fantastic story. But look at so many different elements that have been put into that story. There is the horror element, there is the alien element, there is the closed room element, there is the science element, there is the element of a region that is absolutely uninhabited, that is Antarctica. So all these things put together, it becomes a story of intersectionality. Now, I would rather see it more as a horror science fiction, but there are so many other elements, tropes of science fiction, which you find are, put together, bundled into a classic story of fear. It's a classic story of fear. I always, I talk a lot about dread narratives. So I feel that science fiction is also something that is a part of what I call the dread narrative, because it also invokes the element of the fear of the unknown, the fear of invasion, the fear of any scientific mishap. So there, Campbell creates that element of fear, not just within the characters, but also within the readers, the viewers or the readers, obviously, because they are watching something which goes, what if? And at the end of the story, what happens is a rescue team comes, the last man is taken by them, and then a dog comes running, and they find the dog so cute, they just want to pick up that dog and take it, and they do. And then you realize that the alien has now entered into a human sphere because they are going to bring it back to the mainland. And here there were 5, but there is the rest of humanity. So what happens? Most science fiction is open-ended. So here there is a classic open-endedness in the story. Of course, they kind of devalued the stories by making the Thing 2, and I believe there is also a Thing 3 that has come out. Perfectly horrible movies. So if you want to watch just that version of the Thing. It was directed by John Carpenter, one of the greatest of horror movie directors. He's also the one who made Halloween, if I'm right. And it stars Kurt Russell. Please watch it, and you'll understand the fear factor that is there in a perfectly good science fiction story. So if that is one, then something which I have always been insisting upon in the course of this discussion is where I tell you that science fiction is something that is a kind of a social comment. So do I have to quote those absolute canonical stories like 1984? Or something like The Clockwork Orange, which are dystopian and which kind of tell you that please be aware of how power can corrupt, or how totalitarian regimes can actually erase any semblance of individuality from you. I don't have to tell you that, because I think that is a staple trope when it comes to science fiction. I just mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin, who talks about feminist science fiction. But what about the others? There is, of course, the first of its kind, which is Charlotte Gilman's Herland, or Octavia Butler's Kindred, which is again a Dracula story which is coupled into time traveling and spatio-temporal fluidities. And then do I even have to mention a story like The Handmaid's Tale, which is looking at the gendered perspective of a dystopian regime? We have had scores of writers who talk about dystopia, but here you have a female writer who talks about dystopia from a very gendered perspective. Okay, dystopia is disturbing, but how disturbing is it for a woman? You have the answer in The Handmaid's Tale. Many SF stories are also classic stories of Western, the frontier, or what we would call the Lone Rangers, the hero with a gun, who moves into the far reaches of human spheres and fights for justice. So that is how you have to see the trilogy. I'm sorry, not the trilogy. I always focus only on the original trilogy. But then there are a lot of movies now. So the Star Wars movies, where you have someone like Han Solo, who is, the Lone Ranger. I love the Star Wars movie. So if you see those posters out here, one of those posters is of that movie, the first movie, that is Star Wars. Because it has been my inspiration growing up. Han Solo. You must have seen all those Clint Eastwood movies, right? Fistful of Dollars, or The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. Now, these are stories which are very similar to the spaghetti westerns, but they are set in a galaxy far, far away, in a different galaxy. But the essential story is the same. The hero, the solitary hero who rushes in to save the day. Don't you find that there is so much of an interesting element of commonality when you look at science fiction from these, ideas of the. They have been made into slasher movies also. So probably the most classic science fiction movie, Alien, is basically about a monster, an alien monster, which is called a xenomorph, which is a slasher, a serial killer. It kills everything that comes in its way. Or, the Friday the 13th, classic Friday the 13th movies. There are so many movies of Friday the 13th, but one of those stories is Jason X, where, Jason's body is taken in a spacecraft because they feel that if he's here on Earth, he's going to kill everyone. So he's taken in the air in a spacecraft, and he's supposed to be dumped, in the far regions of space. But he wakes up and there is a killing spree. So see how they're able to take that slasher movies also over there to the space. I'm sure all of you must have enjoyed Steven Spielberg's take on Jurassic Park. It was written as a story first. It was written by Michael Crichton. It came out as a novel. And it was a trend-setting novel because Michael Crichton is actually telling us the fear of what happens if science uses all this technology and recreates all those species which are dead and extinct. We were talking about cloning, we were talking about DNA sequencing, and it was there in science, but Michael Crichton was able to bring all those scientific elements down and told us, narrated a story to us in a very scientific way, but at the same time in a very beautifully imagined way also. What if the T-Rex comes back to life? And he tells us that, come on, you have seen predators, you have seen apex predators, but they are nothing in front of them. The apex of all apex predators is the T-Rex. So what happens if the T-Rex actually is there in front of you? That was a fear that he created. And that was the fear that Steven Spielberg was able to transform into his adaptation, bringing in elements of chaos theory and the butterfly effect. Crichton actually made all these things approachable for the layman. I mean, before him, I don't think anyone even talked about chaos theory. It was there in some of those intellectual or scientific realms of quantum mechanics, quantum physics. But he brought it down to us. He told us that, look, this is how it goes. It's basically like, quantum physics for dummies. Very essential, right? So how does biology, or let's say experimentation with biology, how can it create the end of the world, a doomsday? Of course, Mary Shelley did talk about it. I believe she is the first of the long line of writers who tells us that, don't play God. You're a human, remain a human, don't play God. Because if you play God, this is what is going to happen. So the Frankensteinian monster comes as a symbol of our efforts to play God. So from there to here, from Frankenstein to Jurassic Park, you have an entire trope, a a stream of science fictional writings which are devoted to simply that. Be a human. Don't overreach yourself. And if we are talking about fears, then we also have to address a very important fear, which I'm sure the earlier two speakers would have sort of explained in much more detail. Also, I'll just stop with a single line here, and that is the classic man versus machine. It's a conundrum. For us, the machines are our Frankensteinian monsters. We have created our machines, but I think somewhere down the line, we have come to a realization. I think it's a real, absolute, concrete realization that we cannot survive without our machines. We cannot survive without the machines. I mean, look around us, everything is a machine. And is it a possibility that all these machines one day would just stop working? And if they do, what happens to us? Can we ever have a life without our machines? It's a very interesting question, because I'm there and you are there, and both of us are together because of this machine, this technological miracle that is the laptop and the Zoom platform. But then there is another scare. What if these machines overtake us? And that what if those machines overtake us is something that has been provided by so many different writers in so many different ways. I was just talking to you about Michael Crichton. I go and give you another of his masterpieces. Unfortunately, he died young, so he was not able to create many. But there is this absolute masterpiece called Prey, which deals with nanotechnology. There was a time when nanotechnology was big, and everyone was talking about nanorobots and how these nanorobots are going to save humanity, and how they are going to perform all these intricate operations and surgical interventions also, and how they would be the next thing for humanity. But Crichton asked the question, what if they go wild? What if the nanorobots, they develop a mind of their own? So what happens to humanity in that situation? That's scary. Like, Arthur C. Clarke talking about that particular supercomputer, which he named HAL, taking over that spaceship and refusing the commands of the leader. Now, according to the 3 laws of robotics and everything, the machine is supposed to listen to the human. It's supposed to be obedient to the human. But what if these machines become non-obedient? That is the scare which Arthur C. Clarke creates over there. It is created in that story, I, Robot also. And then we have this very interesting take on man versus machine, which was a short story written by Stephen King, one of the world's greatest horror writers. Now, I mentioned this very specifically because Stephen King is not a science fiction writer, but he has dabbled in a lot of science fiction, and his science fiction is always couched in horror genres and horror tropes. So you have Tommy Knockers, where there is a alien invasion, and then you have the story called Trucks, wherein you talk about how the machines take over in the sense of how the trucks take over. And by trucks, of course, he doesn't mean only trucks. It means all those machines, all those automators, which kind of drive us to it. So what happens if they become the masters, if they develop a sense of intellectual thought, what happens to us? So that is how the story moves. And in the end, we find that the trucks have enslaved us, and the trucks have killed out 2/3 of the human population, but they have kept 1/3 of the population surviving, because ultimately these trucks need to be filled with petrol, diesel, gas. So who fills them? The trucks cannot do that, right? So they keep a few of humanity actually alive, so that they can serve them as slaves. So that is a very scary story. Obviously, we will think that where is this going to happen? How will machines take over is something which I'm sure is the first thought that goes on in your mind. So I would say hold that thought. It's too early. It's just 2022. We do not know what's going to happen in the future, what is going to happen in the next 10 years, because machines have sort of become so advanced that they have started thinking for us. Your smartphones are actually thinking for you. You no longer are, sentient type. You Google something and the next minute your demographics are there. They have prepared algorithms for you, and next time you go to Google, it will itself offer suggestions that this is what you want to read, this is what you want, this is what you want to see, or this is what you want to listen to. So it sort of is putting you into a, can I use that term? It's putting you into a matrix. Now I'm harking back to that classic story. You remember the story, right? You remember the movie Matrix. What if you are caught in the matrix is a very important urban idiom, because I ask you that question, what if it is real? What if we are caught in the matrix? And this is the matrix of our own making, right? So please do have that in your mind, because that is what is absolutely essential. Because otherwise, what is the fun in reading science fiction? Now, friends, I know a lot of us are resistant to science fiction because we feel that, okay, science fiction is simply mainstream. It's not literary. It's not so. I'm just giving you a few examples where these novels, they used the tropes of science fiction, but they were not simply mainstream. They have become canonical. They have become actually very important literary constructs. So, for example, you have Kurt Vonnegut's very important Holocaust novel, which was couched, as I said, in the trope of alien travel and invasion. Slaughterhouse 5. You have Pinken's Gravity Rainbow, which is also using a lot of elements of science fiction. Kazuo Ishiguro is someone you know. He's very popular now because he has got the Nobel Prize for Literature. One of his novels, Never Let Me Go, has got so many parameters of science fiction. Haruki Murakami, one of the most exciting voices in literature today, a profound philosopher when it comes to storytelling, has a lot of stories where you have science fictional elements. One of them, which I'm going to quote out here, is Q1884, which basically is a kind of an appropriation of 1984 science fiction. And what about our own fellow, someone like Amitav Ghosh, who is able to use that intersectionality of post-colonialism and colonial hangovers and able to give that to us in a very science fictional story, that is the Calcutta Chromosome. So, my dear friends, please do not assume that science fiction is something to be rejected, something to be kept outside on the fringes. No. A lot of important writers are taking up science fiction in a big way. They've always been taking it up in a big way. So I think it's time that we kind of gave all those classic science fiction writers a rethink and look at them as social commentators, because they have been doing a great job, not just in the field of fiction, but also in the field of social commentary. Please have that in your mind, because I think that is where we come to the core of what we are discussing today. My hypothesis is that all science fiction is political. There is always an element of power play, of power structures and power hierarchies, which are there in every story of science fiction. It's not just written for excitement. It's not just written for vicarious pleasure. Somewhere down the line, in all those, embroideries of vicariousness or unbridled imagination, lies a social truth. So I would see it more as a writing back, but it's not the writing back which is there in all our how do I put it? Cultural baggage stories, or complaint box stories, or the so-called realism narratives. It's actually very cleverly couched in what I would say is SF solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophy where you become the center stage. So here, if science becomes the center stage, within that you have society also being reflected. Now let's go back to all those original science fiction stories. I mentioned a couple to you. Now, if you're looking at Cyrano de Bergerac's journey to the moon and the sun and back, the alien who comes from moon and sun is actually dark skinned. He has thick lips. His eyelids are heavily dropping. Now, the figure that Bergerac is actually creating is that of the stereotype of the Sambo, the black African heathen or the black African native. So it was a colonial document where he says that the other is actually an alien. Now, this word alien is something which we use for non-national people, right? For us, people outside our borders, they become alien. So look how a social testimony is actually turned into a racial exercise. Have you read something like Gulliver's Travels? I think someone talked about, I think Dr. Arun talked about Gulliver's Travels a lot. I'm sure he must have pointed this out, so I'm not going into intricate detail out here. You have Man Friday, and you have those footprints on the sand, the footprints which look like the cleft of the goat. Now, the cleft of the goat is a very clever symbolism for the devil in itself, for Satan himself. So when someone says the cleft of the goat, he is not just referring to the animal, he's referring to bestiality. And it's as if, Satan himself has come there. It's not Satan, it's the native. And it's the native's footprints which Robinson Crusoe is not able to associate with. Now that, my dear friends, is what a racial exercise is all about. So is there a slur? Is there this whole concept of the white man as the savior? You have seen Avatar. It's one of the biggest selling movies in the world today. But don't you think Avatar is nothing but just Robinson Crusoe sort of, coached in a science fiction story? You have the white man who goes over there and saves the day. If I tell you this one-liner, how would you be able to distinguish between, let's say, a story like Avatar, or a story like Gulliver's Travels, or Robinson Crusoe, or what's the name of that novel where you had those three lads who go and conquer an island? I'm sorry, I forgot that story. Okay.
There's a lot of the flights.
Which one?
A lot of the flights.
No, the Lord of the Flies was actually based on that story. You're right. Lord of the Flies was an adaptation of that story, where you had these three boys, white boys. They go and inhabit an island. I'm sorry, I've become old, I guess. I've forgotten that story. It'll come back to us, or you can always Google it. So, which one is that?
3 Men in a Boat.
No, not 3 Men in a Boat. Not, give me a minute, no? Yeah, it's called Coral Island. You remember that classic story of growing up by R.M. Ballantyne? It's called the Coral Island. So you have these three British white boys, perfect men, like Rudyard Kipling says, in this poem, If. So they go over there and they create a beautiful haven for themselves, and then they find that there are cannibals on that island, and they defeat the cannibals. It's a classic story of how the white man always comes to save the day. So you realize when we talk about science fiction, the origins of science fiction, you find that it's actually a blood time, because it comes from a history of racial injustice. It comes from a history of slavery. And it comes from a place where humanity was at its worst. So ultimately, whenever we talk about that, you find that recent science fiction is more like a resistance. So today we talk about a beautiful concept that is called post-colonial science fiction. Now, that is something which we need to really address, understand, and be aware of. I'm just giving you one source material here. It's called So Long Dreaming. It's a collection. It's an anthology of stories from science fiction. But these are not written by, the white men. It's written by us, those of us who have had a post-colonial history, a colonial history. So it's written by, it's edited by Nalo Hopkinson. The name of the book is So Long Dreaming, Post-Colonial Science Fiction and Fantasy. I came across this book in 2019, and I was able to make a presentation about some of these stories in the University of Penang in Malaysia, where it was well received because I was able to point out to them that there are so many tropes which are basically taken from our oppressors. You see, that's how Toril Moy says, no, it's called an appropriation. So we take it from them and we use it against themselves, a kind of a Calibanist technique, which we are doing with science fiction. So you should read a story like Vandana Singh, one of the most exciting science fiction writers from India today. She's from Delhi, basically. One of her classic stories is called The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet. So we talk about, women's consciousness and the idea of the women's body. Someone like Charlotte Perkins Gilman has addressed this in the Yellow Wallpaper. But I think Vandana Singh looks at it more from the point of view of a disgruntled Indian middle-class woman and how she is able to cope up with this inanities of life. The conventional inanities of life. What is a woman's lot? Get up in the morning, cook food for her husband who doesn't even bother to, eat it with any kind of an appreciation and, send him off. And then what? Do nothing. Wait for him to come, or if you have children, you sort of send them to. Now here we have this woman who suddenly assumes that she becomes a planet. I'm not going to tell you the entire story. Please read it. It's available online. You can get a free PDF. I'm not advocating any copyright infringement, but it's available. So maybe you can just read it. Of course, there is this time traveling story that's called Delhi, which looks at the history of Delhi through the eyes of an individual who has the capacity to time travel. So he goes to various landmarks and signposts in the history of Delhi, and he meets all those rulers of Delhi, and he tries to warn them about what is going to come, the impending doom that they are going to face, because dynasties rise and dynasties fall. But who bothers? Who listens to a soothsayer? He or she uses the idea that is called a member. Now, the member is a kind of a derivation of someone like Homi Bhabha's, concept of post-colonial remembering. Because remember, as Bhabha, Vandana Singh is also trying to tell us that, the past is a traumatic history, and it becomes traumatic because of all these aggressions that India has met from so many different invaders. I know it's a problematic zone, but she's able to address it in a very beautiful way. Or someone like Nalo Hopkinson, the editor, also writes a story. And there we talk about, how a classic fairy tale, you must have heard of the story of Bluebird and how he murders his wives. So this classic story is seen from the perspective of Bluebird being a member of the indigenous African tribe community. So how is his take and why does he do that? A very interesting take on that story, where here Bluebird becomes the symbol of the image of someone who has to be seen in a very sympathetic light, not as the deranged serial killer who is in the original story. Or an Indonesian writer like Greg Van Eekhout, who talks about the concept of the native aliens. Remember, It's a kind of a rewriting of Cyrano de Bergerac's idea of the alien. So when there is a colonial intervention, what happens to the natives themselves? They are looked on as outsiders. So this is the point that he is trying to make out there. So if I say that every science fictional story is political, then we have to see the politics in every random science fiction trope. So when I use that term kaiju, now kaiju is Japanese science fiction dealing with gigantic monsters. Now this is not just a story of, huge monsters which kind of become rampaging creatures that are going out to destroy life as we know it. No, these are monsters which are created by our scientific misadventures. So if you have seen the kaiju movies, if you have seen a movie like Godzilla, you will understand that Godzilla is simply a reptile that has mutated beyond our realms of thought because of nuclear radiation. So here we have a story that tells us that nuclear radiation is wrong. It tells us that science is a demon. You understand that? Godzilla is a demon of our own making. That's a political statement. Science is wrong. Science can be, we know it's a boon, but science can be a curse. That's the trope that we find in a kaiju movie. Or if a movie like Ridley Scott's Alien, the original Ridley Scott's Alien movie, you find that is the scene from, do you see that alien? It's a face hugger. It's called a face hugger. It attaches itself to your face and, to the victim's face. And then one fine day it falls off, and then out of his chest erupts the alien creature. Beautiful way. You should see that scene at least, from the original Aliens movie. Of course, later on it was made into so many different revisions and, editions. But the first movie, because there again we are looking at, it's a kind of an avatar, but here you have the native that is overtaking the white. So science, see, it was the thirst for scientific advancement that leads to all these colonial excursions. So these kind of movies, they kind of showcase that also. There is the recent phenomenon, we talk about zombies a lot. Zombies have become huge today, and Korean, series are also. So in that intersection, you have something like All of Us Are Dead, the Netflix series, which is about a zombie apocalypse. Yes, but this zombie apocalypse starts from a point of ragging and bullying, which is so prevalent in those colleges. And from there, we go to the element of science. So these two things put together, combined, come up with this social documentary that is called All of Us Are Dead. Now, I'm just, kind of giving you 3 other examples. I want you to look this up. There is this very exciting series. There are 2 series now, season 1 and season 2. It's a Netflix series that is called Love, Death and Robots. Please watch them. It's a kind of an anthology with very short movies. Okay, these movies are like 10 to 15 minutes each, and every season has got some 8 to 10 stories, if I'm right. So you can watch them in, let's say, less than 3 hours, and it covers almost the entire spectrum of science fiction. So many exciting new tropes which you find there. Similarly, there is this series that is called Altered Carbon, which you should watch. And I'm sure all of you are very much familiar with the X-Men series. Now, the X-Men series seems to be a fantasy, but remember, couched within that fantasy is the fear again of the freak, the fear of the mutant, the fear of anyone who is not like us. So if you look at someone like Mystique, or you look at someone like Wolverine, or you look at any Magneto or anyone there, you understand that the world is against them because they are supposedly not natural. That is the way we treat all those people with disabilities. Remember that. So it's a social document. It's a social commentary. So there are, these elements which we have to look into, and science fiction always has its own words. So I am coming to my last words, because these are some of those quotations which have become hugely popular when it comes to science fiction. So we talk about explorations of science, and there is this beautiful TV series, old TV series, which is now being readapted. I'm sure you must have watched it, Star Trek, the original series versus the new age series, where the tagline was "Space, the final frontier." So imagine how space is being conquered. Shows that. I go and hark back again and again to my favorite movie, that is Alien, where the fear factor comes when the tagline goes, "In space, no one can hear you scream." I'm sure you must have watched the Terminator movies, and second Terminator movie is considered to be one of the best movies, where the classic conundrum, which I've already pointed out, man versus machine, is being addressed. And there you have the Terminator, which is played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who says, "I'll be back." So, he keeps coming back. Maybe he shouldn't, but, he keeps coming back. Or, the classic story again of which I've already mentioned, where the computer says, "I'm sorry, Dave, I am afraid I cannot do that," which is basically an element where the computer or the technology refuses to address you, to heed to you. That's scary. Or a beautiful story like when androids dream of electric sheep, where again the android is the one who is able to give you a human element when the android says that maybe I can go where I can see stars. It's a very beautiful human element that is given. Remember, that story has been the inspiration of so many scores of such movies, including, I think the Tamil Masala movie, that is Iyandiran, or the second part of you. So it is a creation of so many different ideologies. It's a creation of so many different realities. Now, these realities might not be the kind of realities that we see, but they might be realities which are there in probably imagination, or in probably places where your minds have not yet reached. So the idea of a multiverse, which I believe has become very trending today because of, the DC and the Marvel movies. But remember, they were not the ones to start with the idea of multiverses. Multiverse is actually a term that has been borrowed by, let's say, someone like Stan Lee from science fiction stories. So the idea of a multiverse or a parallel world was, let's say, is there in, let's say, a story like Flatlands. It's a very interesting story, because Flatlands looks at society from two-dimensional shapes and sizes. So everyone there is not a three-dimensional, fully fleshed human being. It's rather a two-dimensional shape. So it might be a triangle, or it might be a square, or it might be a pentagon. So that's the way society works in Flatlands. It's a mathematical equivalent of a story. So it's a science fiction, which is very rare in one way, because it's a mathematical science fiction. If you have seen Doctor Who, if you're a fan of Doctor Who, you know that Doctor Who has a cupboard sort of a thing that is called a TARDIS. And in that TARDIS, he can basically go anywhere. So it's like Alice in Wonderland's looking glass, or, the lamp which the genie inhabits in, let's say, a story like Arabian Nights. So all these fictional cosmoses, so there are so many kind of fictional cosmoses. They sort of give us an idea of life which exists, as I said, beyond the realm of our ordinary conventional thought. And please do not think that, there are no Indians in this also. There are a lot of Indians who are doing exciting work in the field of science fiction. I've already mentioned someone like Vandana Singh to you, Amitav Ghosh to you. These are other writers. Jayant Narlikar is one of the first science fictional writers from India. He has given us a lot of collections of short stories, which are very exciting. He kind of, influxes science fictional trope within the idea of an Indian sensibility. It's worth reading. Samit Basu, of course, has created the Simoquin Prophecies, which is a trilogy. And from that trilogy, he has gone on and written so many different books. Unfortunately, we don't read him much, but I think he is a writer whom we should take seriously and at least, indulge in one of his books. Satyajit Ray has given us so many important earlier stories, of science fiction, where we have Professor Trishanku, who, explores so many different regions. Fantastic. Our own Sujata. I think one of his masterpieces, magnum opuses, is where he talks about, the concept of the holograph. He has used it in so many horror elements. I believe there is this story of his, which is Yen Inia Yendira, which is a source work for, a lot of Tamil science fiction movies also. And something that came out very recently is this dystopian novel that is called Leela by Prayag Akbar. It was also made into a Netflix series. I suggest that you watch that also. You will understand how, science fiction works in the Indian context. So I think this should be my last slide. I'll end it here with one of my favorite quotations, which I use in so many different contexts. That is so long, and thanks for all the fish. So it's my farewell to you. Of course, lifting very obviously from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, one of my favorite books, where the hero is given a farewell from the dolphins. And the dolphins tell him that so long you've given us all these fishes, thank you so much. But it's a kind of a backhanded compliment, because the dolphins would have actually fooled him to get their food. So it's basically a kind of a social commentary where, the dolphins are saying that you guys are not smart, we are. So it's like, you go to Dolphin World and you look at all those dolphins performing for us, and we feel good because, we have conquered the dolphins. But this is a reversal of that. And, here the dolphins say that, you have not conquered us. We have come here willingly because, what, we need food and we need it free. So we perform all these antics to fool you so that we get off. That kind of a attitude which we have, which is here. So I think starting from someone, let's say, like Jonathan Swift in the Fourth Voyage of Gulliver, where he talks about the Yahoos and the Unhims, coming down to the dolphins, I think science fiction is one genre that keeps us in a constant state of reality check, because it tells us that, remember, you have limited time in the world, you have limited capacity. So see this, read this, and understand that you are nothing. The human in the wide world of uncertainties is something that I believe science fiction actually points out. So read a lot of science fiction, understand its social commentary. Don't just read it for the fantastic visions that it creates, but read it for all those social realities which are hidden behind the veneer of, let's say, an illusion. Because that is exactly what science fiction is, and that is exactly what the tropes of science fiction do. So thank you. It was great talking to you people. I just lost track of time, but fortunately I have finished it on time. So thanks. If there are any questions, you can always address them to me.
Professor, thank you for your wonderful lecture, and we have a couple of questions posted from the participants.
Okay.
If you please, can I read it for you, Professor?
Sure. You can.
From Dr. V. Anuraga, the question is, can you kindly mention some interesting contemporary graphic scientific fiction? Few teleserials like Yen Inia Yendira, based on the writer Sujata's novels, and movies like Godzilla and King Kong have undoubtedly fascinated and inspired me a lot during my childhood days to explore the realm of scientific fiction.
Thank you, Dr. Anuraga. She's from Villarreal College for Women. I had the extreme fortune of addressing some people in an international conference at Villarreal College, I think yesterday or day before. Thank you for that question. But if you want me to give you a list of graphic novels which deal with science fiction, I think it's available. You can just Google them, a lot of them. I think this session was not about, giving you information about the books per se, but it was more about, for you to get an understanding and go and read them. When it comes to graphic science fiction, I think most of the canonical stories have been sort of adapted into the graphic series. For example, Star Wars, which comes out as a movie or, as a series of movies, was sort of adapted into the graphic, one of the earliest of the adaptations into the graphic stories. There is this very interesting flash fiction, which is a classical retake of, let's say, the 39 steps, which was made into hypertext, and then it was adapted into graphic fiction. Also, there are lots. I do not know what to sort of mention. The umpteen number of things. But I'm happy that you have grown up watching all these movies and reading all these classic stories. You know what? Keep up that the passion for scientific fiction, because it's going to hold you in good stead. All the very best for you. Yeah, of course. We have Jayanti Shivanandam, who has given us a very interesting insight. She says that R.L. Stevenson's Treasure Island or Dr. Jekyll and, yeah, of course, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is science fiction, but see how he is able to kind of coach that science fictional elements into a sort of a horror story, a sort of a gothic story. So yes, I agree with you. Okay, I don't find any more questions. And thanks for all those words of appreciation, every one of you. Thank you so much.
So thank you for your excellent and erudite lecture on the topic of Kaijus to Chekhov's X and everything else. So really, this session was helping us to explore the unexplored areas. Thank you so much for throwing lights on the novels, especially the Indian novelists, characters, terms, symbols, settings, and the list of tropes. Once again, thank you, sir, for helping us to understand the intricacies of science in fiction and fiction in science. Yet again, you have proved, sir, you are not only a great teacher, but also a very great awakener. Thanks a lot, sir. And
Thank you for those words. Thank you.
May I request Dr. Suresh Frederick, the organizer of the FDP, and UG Head, Dean Research and Development, to propose the concluding remarks.
Before we move on to the regular vote of thanks, I just want to say a few of my observations. So as an organizing secretary of this, I'm really happy that we have chosen this topic, science fiction. Especially on the first day, Dr. Abdul set the tone for the whole FDP. In fact, we really enjoyed him bringing in beautiful interpretations. Thank you very much, sir. Same way. Second day also, we really enjoyed Dr. Lakshmi Nair's Reality Ahead of Schedule. Of course, today, as usual, Professor Jinnah sir has brought in a lucid way, he has presented that. In fact, I was able to go back in memory because my dad only introduced me to English movies. We used to go together. My dad from MCC used to take me to English movies. I still remember he took me once to the Godzilla movie, very old, black and white movie. I still remember Japanese movie. From that, many Western movies. Still remember, especially I wish to today mention the name of Dr. Suresh Kumar. He used to speak about this. He used to deliberate on some of the movies. Really happy that even though they may not be from science fiction films, many of those movies are super, and I really enjoyed watching them. Today, sir, thank you for bringing in such a memory to my mind. And also, especially when you think of, because I'm teaching MPhil social realism by Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams also talks about this as social formula novel. He calls this a social formula novel. So you rightly pointed out that realism is also part of this. So thank you, sir. Thank you for bringing in a lot of inputs for our students, as well as many of the professors attended that. Thank you very much. I also wish to thank all my fellow teachers, especially the group as organizing committee. Did a marvelous job shouldering the responsibility. Sitting from 4:30 to 6 is a bit difficult for a person who's working in the day college. So I'm really thankful to you and thank all of you for this. And now I request Dr. Melvin to propose the word of thanks.
Warm greetings to all the participants of this 3-day faculty development program. On this memorable occasion, it is my privilege to propose the word of thanks on behalf of the organizing committee. The Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Thankfulness and praises are due to our God Almighty, who helped us enjoy this intellectual treat. My heart fills with a lot of gratitude and respect for all the resource persons who spared their invaluable time to grace this occasion and enlighten us with their commendable talk on the subject. All three speakers have indeed put the best of their efforts to make this event unforgettable. The first day speaker, Dr. Arun Lal, elaborated on science fiction and the poetics of post-human with such ease and clarity. We thank you, sir. Yesterday's speaker, Dr. Lakshmi R. Nair, reflected on the topic, Reality Ahead of Schedule, Tools of Scholarship, and looked at science fiction from different vantage points. I thank you, ma'am. And today's resource person, Dr. Abdul Mohammed Ali Jinnah, sir, contemplated on the topic from Kaijus to Chekhov's eggs and everything else in between, understanding the tropes of contemporary science fiction. Thank you, sir, for reflecting on the diverse yet important signposts of science fiction and taking us on a joy ride to the broad spectrum of science fiction. Thank you so much, sir. Wow. We are grateful to Dr. Paul Diabron, the principal of Bishop Heber College, for his constant encouragement in all our endeavors, and we record our respect and indebtedness to the head of the Department of English, Dr. S. Shobana, for her generous support for the smooth conduct of this faculty development program. Warm appreciation is due to Dr. Suresh Frederick, the UG head and indomitable organizing secretary of this 3-day faculty development program, for meticulously arranging the FDP and working hard behind the scene to make sure things came out all right. Thank you, sir. I profusely thank the organizing committee members, Dr. Newton Raja, Dr. Susigaran, Dr. Ronald David, Dr. Suresh Kumar, Mr. Edwin Moses, Dr. Arti Priya, Mr. Yakub, Dr. J. Prem Kumar, Mr. Pagalavan, Mr. Matthew Merkusala, for planning, finding the right resource persons, taking up the responsibilities and executing them with precision. I'm running short of words to express my humble thanks to all the faculty members and scholars who have participated and made your presence felt in the 3 days of faculty development program. I also thank Mr. Baran from IT for his support and Mr. Murugesh for his assistance. I'm sure the 3 days venture was an eye-opener And I believe that you will venture deep, learn, and research in the genre of science fiction. God bless you all. Have a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you.